with a 30-second sort of review. I'm going to read the passage actually first, and then I'll do that. So we're going to read verses 3 through 7. We're really in verses 5, 6, and 7 in the book of Jude, and but really 3 and 4 have a lot to do with the context of the entire book, so I'm going to read those first. So Jude, starting in verse 3, Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Again, like I said a couple weeks ago, it's just a rosy text full of super encouraging stuff, right? So to revisit just briefly, I think it's important to see in verse 5, he says that there is a tendency to forget. I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it. The way that he starts this is to say there are things that you knew, and there are some things that are easy to forget. In fact, the prerequisite for forgetting something is that you knew it in the first place, right? Like you can't forget something that you didn't know. You can be ignorant of a lot of stuff, but you can't forget something that you did not know initially. And so Jude leans in and says, this is not new information, but this is information that has drifted away. And so I think there's a correction really all through Jude leading up to, I hate putting these glasses on, leading up to really verse 17, where there's this call to persevere. Jude is coming with a pretty strong correction to the body of Christ, to the church. He's not unloving with it, because correction is one of the ways that we know God loves us. And that's a hard part of love, right? But Jude is real clear that if I don't course correct you, then I'm not doing my job in an apostolic way. If I don't say some things that grind against you a little bit, then there's never any change. There's never any shaping. If the potter doesn't actually put his hands to the clay and begin to work with that clay and cut stuff, carve stuff, shape stuff, move stuff, if there's no manipulation, and I mean that word in really just the physical sense. I don't mean that he's manipulating a people, tricking a people. I mean, if there's no shaping of our life, then there is no love that we've actually received. And so we live in a world that doesn't love correction, but we've always lived in a world that doesn't love correction. So this is not a new thing at all. I don't know that there's ever been a generation of kid that just love to be disciplined. Because children are sinful. A little baby that's so cute has a dark heart that wants its own way, right? Like that's just because God's grace covers that kid, that does not mean that that kid is not sinful. Like we're born with a nature that is filled up with sin and rebellion and self-centeredness. And so the idea is that whenever we are shaped and corrected, we're being moved against our will. The power of the gospel is seen in the idea that Jesus says there's actually a better will than yours and mine. The will of the Father will always be better than our will. And to a degree, over time, we come to believe that or we come to reject that. And so Jude is correcting us here. So I told you I'm just going to work through these three verses 5, 6, and 7. I think there's some beautiful things in these verses. And so we'll just walk through these things. So verse 5, Jesus, who saved a people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. I want to point something out really quick, because before we get into what the rest of the verse says, there's something really unique that Jude does here that is not necessarily expected if you were keeping score throughout the Bible, he says that the people who were delivered out of Egypt, you remember the story if you've walked through the Bible at all, the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob wound up in slavery when a Pharaoh came into power that did not know Joseph. Joseph had brought salvation to Egypt and the surrounding world through God's wisdom and Joseph's ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams and make plans for the next 14 years. Well, Joseph comes to a place where he passes away, and a new ruler comes into power and realizes we've got all these people in this land who are not of us, and so maybe what we ought to do is create slaves out of them so they don't become so great that they take over our nation. So they do that, and so the children of Israel are enslaved for years and years and years. Well, eventually God is going to deliver them out of slavery, out of bondage, out of Pharaoh's hand, out of the land of Egypt. What's unique about this text is that Jude says this about his brother. He says that the one who delivered them out of the land of Egypt was Jesus. I know for us on this side of things in America, in evangelical Christianity, in this church with the Bible that we have, that doesn't seem earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but I'm telling you, this would have sounded to most practicing Jews like an anachronism. Jesus existed a few years before this text was written. Jesus did not exist 4,000 years before when this was going on. And so the idea here is so powerful that Jude says, I want you to know this is not some nebulous idea of God, some ethereal force or power in heaven. Jesus, the one who I shared a womb with, Jesus, the one who was on a cross and came out of a tomb, he was there at that time as well. And the reason Israel had an origin story outside of Egypt in the first place was because of Jesus Christ. It's a powerful thing that Jude says here. Jesus isn't seen even destroying the Egyptians necessarily, but what's also interesting is it does not say, look at the text. I think it's Jesus who saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. Look, he's not talking about Egypt. Jude's not talking about Jesus just delivering them out of Egypt. Jude is talking about Jesus being the one who judged Israel in the wilderness. The ability to believe, which it says at the end of that verse, he destroyed those who did not believe. The ability to believe is fundamental to living the life that God has actually called us to. What you see, and I'm going to read from Deuteronomy chapter 1 in just a second. We are called as Christians to believe in a way that passes the baton of belief to those coming after us. And the great sin and the great failure of the generation that left Egypt miraculously and began in the wilderness, the great failure of that generation was that they did not pass a faith on to those coming after them. Instead, they grumbled and they griped and they complained about everything that was going on the other side of their salvation. It's important to see this as well. The Greek word for destroyed there, I don't know the pronunciation exactly, but it's something like apolemi. That literally means to put out of the way or to render useless. So read verse 5 that way. Jesus, who saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterward put out of the way those who did not believe. This Jesus afterward rendered useless those who did not believe. I think Jude's warning here is not saying people who doubt are going to be destroyed. So be very careful. I am not here to lay that kind of weight of burden upon you, because people who doubt are finding God's presence. That's not really what was going on in the wilderness. Jude is saying that that a generation who has been saved and redeemed must become a generation who refuses to allow the freedom of salvation to become an opportunity for complaining. I'm going to read that again. Jude says that a generation who has been saved and redeemed must become a generation who refuses to allow the freedom of salvation to become an opportunity for complaining. We get complaints a lot in our world. We have complaint boxes. Restaurants, you can go online and you can tell them how the service was. You can give them 1 star, 5 stars. Some of y'all relish the opportunity to just lay the wood to that poor waiter. I went on somebody else's dime, which is the best kind of golf to play when somebody else is paying for it. But I had taken my son last Friday to play golf in a tournament in Tennessee. And on the way back, so it's a story for another day, but I won a trophy for the first time in like 30 years. Not because I played well. I think the whole thing was rigged. But yes, yeah, it's participation trophy. I'll just let you know that trophy's sitting on our mantle in our living room right now. I'm not letting that go. So, but I had it sitting up on the dash of my car so everybody who was driving around me could see that thing on my way home from Tennessee. And so I was driving about 5 miles over the speed limit, but I had gotten into the left-hand lane, and which apparently I shouldn't have done. And so I was trying to find a song on my phone. Don't judge me. I do it all the time. I'm still here. So God is sovereign. But I apparently that was not fast enough. So there was a car that, man, zoomed around me and just as quickly as they passed, just slid right back into the left-hand lane. There was nobody for like a quarter mile ahead of us. They were sliding back in front of me to prove a point. And then they rolled down their window, and I saw one hand shoot out the window, not with a finger, just a hand, and the other hand in the dash, and they're just doing this. Like, I know that that's directed toward me. So I took the trophy, and I held it up to them. That's a true story, friend. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. That's the reason I love sarcasm. I just thought to myself, like, why would you complain when you got around me? It's not like you couldn't get around me. You got around me just fine. There was nobody else here. But we're so quick to gripe about things. I don't know if griping just makes us feel better. I don't know what it is, but the complainers of that generation were a profound version of complaint. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, there's some select verses. I'm going to read 26 to 28 and 34 to 40. Moses is speaking here. This is how he opens this long sermon to Israel. About 38 years, give or take. Maybe they've been in the wilderness by the time Moses actually comes to this point where he's going to deliver this word to the people of Israel. And Moses really starts to lean in. He says, "Yet you would not go up, but you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God, and you murmured in your tents. And you said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us out of the land of Egypt." Listen to the language. Because God hated us, he set us free. Because God hated us, he liberated us. Because God hated us, he brought us out of Egypt, over the Red Sea, into this place. Because God hated us to give us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us. Where are we going up? Our brothers have made our hearts melt, saying, these people are greater and taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And besides, we have seen the sons of the Anakim there. So he's referencing the 12 spies that went into the land of Canaan, came back and gave the report. You can read about that in Numbers chapter 14 if you want. Verse 34, Moses continues. "And the Lord heard your words and was angered. And he said," or he swore, "not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give your fathers." First of all, look carefully. They did not sin in the way that we consider sin to be sin. They were not entering into some kind of crazy immorality. They were not entering into some kind of crazy lack of ethics. They were not, at this point, immediately, they were not sacrificing things they shouldn't sacrifice. Like this is just because when the spies came back, they said, we can't go where God told us we can go. And so Moses says, this is what God said, "Not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers. Except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to him and to his children I will give the land on which he has trodden, because he has wholly followed the Lord." Verse 37, "Even with me, the Lord was angry on your account. And the Lord said, you also shall not go in there." This is Moses speaking about himself now. God told Moses, "Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall enter. So encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit the land. And as for your little ones, who you said would become prey, and your children, who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there. And to them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But as for you, turn and journey into the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea." He said, because when you were set free, you used your freedom to gripe and complain and murmur, because that was your response to my great gift. You will not find the promise to be something that you take hold of, but your children will. Remember what Jude said in verses 3 and 4? That there is a perverting of grace. There is a losing of the faith that was once given to the saints. There's a twisting of what God has given us. This is the whole premise of the letter. What perverts the grace of God and attacks the faith? Those who attempt to influence the church away from trusting the promises of God. Yeah.
So, was it the murmuring and complaining, or was it the lack of trust in God?
Both those things happen at the same time, I think. Those things are always hand in hand. We gripe when we don't trust. Hope creates optimism. When you lose hope, optimism is evacuated, I think. Would you agree? Yeah. So the second thing I had here, what perverts the grace of God? Those who complain in such a way that it undermines the church's trust in the direction and the sovereignty of God. I think so often what Jude is saying here is that when Jesus saves a people, and I think that's why he's saying that Jesus saved those people, because Jude wants to make sure that we realize that the same Savior of Israel was the Savior of us. And so what Israel did is just as much a temptation as for us as it was for them, because it's the same Savior. And generally speaking, after salvation, we walk into the same places of wilderness. Promise comes on the other side of wilderness. Generally, the taking hold of something really great takes place after seasons or moments of struggle and difficulty, because that is supposed to be the galvanizing time. Prosperity does not galvanize trust. Challenge galvanizes trust. And God is not afraid to bring people into places. Just after Jesus is baptized in Matthew chapter 3, the very next text is, it says the Spirit of God drove him into the wilderness where he was tempted by Satan for 40 days. Like, this is something that even Jesus went through, because moments of wilderness galvanize the trust of identity that's created by salvation. When God says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, you should listen to him," the next thing that happens is Jesus goes into a hard place, because after that, this is when he's going to walk out all. Now, Jesus is perfect. He's the Son of God, and yet the journey is the same even for him. I think it's fascinating. Let's see if I can find this again. I had something else typed out here. I want to make sure I get this right. There's this song by Sarah Grove, who I like Sarah Grove very much. She has this, it's a song, I think it's on her first or second album or whatever. It's called Painting Pictures of Egypt. And I just want to read a couple of lines from this. I think this is a powerful, powerful thing. She says, "The places I long for the most are the places where I've been. They are calling out to me like a long-lost friend. And the place I wasn't perfect, but I had found a way to live. And it wasn't milk or honey, but then neither is this. The past is so tangible, I know it by heart. Familiar things are never easy to discard. I was dying for some freedom, but now I hesitate to go. I'm caught between the promise and the things that I know." And the chorus goes this way: "I've been painting pictures of Egypt and leaving out what it lacks, because the future looks so hard and then I want to turn back. But the places that used to fit me cannot hold the things I've learned. Those roads are cut off to me, or those roads were cut off to me when my back was turned." I love that image, that it's so easy to say the thing that I came from is better than the thing that I'm in now, because I can't reach and take hold of the thing that's been promised to me. The problem is that the Red Sea didn't say split open, and God did that intentionally, because if it had, they would have walked back into the very place that had been the brutality of their lives, instead of into the place that was the freedom of their life and existence. And I think it's the same thing for us. We start looking back at the past and we say, that was better because I could understand it. I could make sense of it. It was comfortable. Even though it was hard, I could at least know what was coming each day. But in this wilderness, I don't know what I can trust. And it's so easy to paint pictures of where we were before. but we leave out all the bad parts and we just make it real rosy. I've heard so many people talk about how the church was so good in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s because everybody went to church and everything was great and the music was better back then and the Spirit was really moving back then. Yeah, people were illiterate and men were going home and beating their wives behind closed doors, and they were still elders in the church, and we were struggling and dealing with deep, deep levels of hypocrisy because it was expected that you looked the part when you walked outside, even if behind the walls of your house you were a hellion. This is the problem with what happens when we start looking back and painting these real soft pictures without any definitive lines. We start making the past out to be the thing that we would prefer instead of the future, when the future is what God has actually promised us. There's a type of fish, there's actually 1,600 types of fish that are referred to as cartilaginous fish. I had to look that one up. Did not know how to pronounce the word. Cartilaginous. Sharks, rays, those kind of, that kind of, so one of the unique parts about cartilaginous fish is that they don't have a skeletal structure, they're all cartilage. And in order to breathe, they have what is called, I wrote this down, ram ventilation is the way that they breathe. So they have gills in slits near the front of their body or in some area where when they move forward by the propulsion of their tail and their fins, that water is rammed through those gills. They have no muscle structure that pulls water in. They have to be moving forward in order for the water to be pulled in. As you know, fish breathe by filtering the oxygen out of the water. And as I was reading that, I was reading actually this passage, I was reminded, I had to look up cartilaginous. I didn't just have that like on tap. I needed to know what they were called. But I know that those fish, generally scientists believe that they don't actually sleep. They have moments when they are more rested, or when they are resting instead of their activity is not as intense, but they don't actually sleep because they have to be moving at some level or in some way in order to continue to breathe. Now, I know humans have to Sabbath and we have to sleep and we have to rest or else our bodies go into decay. But I do think that the inner life of the Christian is more like these cartilaginous fish than the physical life is. I think if we're not moving forward, then we're not actually receiving the nourishment that allows our faith to be exercised. You realize, like, we shouldn't make fun of her, I guess. It's kind of a tragic story, but we poke fun of, and there are jokes about, like, Lot's wife being salty or whatever, you know? I don't even know if I'm okay, like, with those jokes. But anyway, because she looks back, everything changes. You know, isn't it ironic that that's really the entire story of Israel a few generations later? It just took 40 years instead of a few moments. They didn't turn to salt, they turned to dust because they kept on looking backward. And at some level, like, the church has to be really aware that the longer we look in reverse and romanticize the places where we once were, and the less we're looking forward and trusting by faith that God actually has a promise for us, it's not going to equal peace or joy. It's going to equal suffocation of our faith. And that's a discipline, right? I'm not here to tell you that's easy. Because listen, fundamentally, and I could dig into this all night, but I don't want to get on to the next thing. But fundamentally, like, what we know is that what we've been through, we know we can get through. If I've already done it, then I look back on it because I know I can get through it again if I had to. But when I'm in a place that I have not been, I've got to rework and rewire and re-understand and innovate and trust and pray and walk by faith and walk in places that are murky and dim. And we hate that because we like to be in control. And so the moving into the future is the one requirement is that I give over into God's hands what God says can be done, even if I don't believe it can be done by me. But when I look back, man, I see those victories, or I see that one moment, and I made a really great decision. I think, God, why can't I go back there? And I think the church spends so much time, or it's tempted, not all churches do, but I think there's a temptation to spend so much time in that place where we know we can make it through it. The problem is that we're not actually passing a faith on to another generation. And And isn't it amazing that the great judgment of God over these people is that he had to move them out of the way and render them useless? Again, that's what the word destroy means. He had to move them out of the way, get them out of the way, and render them useless so that another generation could walk into the places that God had promised. How tragic is it if we're not walking with our children and grandchildren into the things that God has actually promised us? Because we're stubborn. Because we're not as courageous in our 60s as we were in our 20s. You know, he talks about Caleb in Deuteronomy 1. I got to move on, but just give me just another second. I guess you're going to give it to me. So, he talks about Caleb, right? And at 80, Caleb says, I'm not done yet, man. Give me the toughest mountain in this land and I'll take it for my family. I don't care how old I am. And if there's anything left in the tank. I sat in line when the power was out for 2.5 hours, the QT in Duncan. It's a terrible decision. 8 cars away from the gas pump, and the gas ran out. We were down past the Cracker Barrel, and we saw the tanker truck pull in and refill the tanks. And by the time we made it, like I said, about 8 cars back, all tapped out. People turning around, and I rolled my window down. I talked to somebody driving by. I was like, what's going on? And I felt like I knew, but I wanted a confirmation. I said, they told us they're all out. They're putting the yellow things over the pumps, and so there's no more gas. I'm like, great. Do you know what I didn't do? I didn't stay there and just kind of hope that there was going to be another tanker sometime in the next 2 or 3 days. We had a 1/4 tank of gas in that truck. We're going to get home. We're going to the place where we belong. And I just think some of us are worried about running out of gas. My God, don't worry about running out of gas. Worry about not getting home. Worry about not getting into the place where promise is. Maybe we're supposed to run out on the way. Isn't that what Elijah told the widow? If you'll fix it for me, if you'll do what God has told you, you'll find that you don't actually run out of oil on the way. You'll have more oil than you were supposed to have. But when we start to conserve in the Christian life, we don't move forward in the future because we don't think we got the energy, the courage, the fuel, whatever, the time. I don't care about the time. If God truly holds my life sovereignly, then the time that I have is the time that I need. And if that ends tonight, then okay, I did what I was supposed to do. I've yelled at you guys for 3.5 years, and that's what God wanted me to do. Praise Jesus. You'll find somebody else to yell at you for another 3.5. If I live until I'm 85, okay, I just hope that when I crest some of those later years, I just hope that I see my life not as a life that's running out of fuel, but a life that needs to hit the gas and make the most out of everything that I've got inside. I told you before, I want to see my kids. If I get to see my grandkids, I want to see them walk in their prophetic calling. I want to see them walk in the revival that was promised in Joel chapter 2. I want to see them in those places and in those moments. Psalm 23:4, the literal reading says, though I walk in the valley of the shadow. But 99% of translations don't render it, though I walk in the valley of the shadow. They all render it, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Because I think there's an understanding doctrinally that when you're walking with God, you're not walking into wilderness places to stay there. You're always walking in those places to move through there. And the worst thing we can do is turn around and go backwards. Verse 6. Angels, who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. Angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. So this passage is connected with 2 Peter 2:4. It's almost, in fact, identical to what Peter says in 2 Peter 2:4. And Jude's words are speaking of fallen angels in some way. And so I will completely admit this is a murky passage. This is very difficult to make sense of. We don't know if he's speaking prophetically of those angels who will be cast into the lake of fire. Maybe he's speaking of the fall of the angels who followed Lucifer that we get some of the word about in the major prophets, or these other angelic beings in some other situation we don't know about. We don't actually have this full explanation of what Jude's talking about. But I think the challenge for us is not to get caught up in what we don't fully know. I think it's to make sure we don't lose sight of what is completely clear. What's clear about the text is that God is very willing to confine those who rebelliously attempt to distance themselves from their calling and seek to exert their authority and power in places where they don't belong. I hope you all come back next week. Yeah, I will. God is willing to confine those who rebelliously attempt to distance themselves from their calling and seek to exert their authority in places that they don't belong. Look at the verse again after I said that. Angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, those angels he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. God has confined and incarcerated those who misused their authority. It's an expression of pride that we read about here. Because it's one thing to accidentally or ignorantly find ourselves doing the wrong thing. Again, this is not Jude expecting perfection out of people. Jude's not saying that, oh, if I made a mistake, God's going to throw me into eternal darkness and chain me up in gloomy places. That is not at all what Jude is saying. Please let that kind of, let your mind rest from that. This is actually knowing what we've been called to do and intentionally taking that gift and using it in a way that harms and hurts instead of a way that builds and heals. So interesting, I won't get to the third one. It's just fine. But maybe I won't. A fascinating example of this would be Numbers 20. You don't have to turn there. I'm just going to reference it in big picture terms. But Moses, we talked about the children of Israel leaving Egypt. Moses leaves Egypt first, goes, has his family. He's keeping his father-in-law's flocks and herds, and then the bush burns. Moses goes over, has a conversation with God, walks back to Egypt, stands in front of the most powerful man in the world and says, let your labor force go because they need to go worship something other than you. They go back and forth, obviously, with the plagues. Moses eventually delivers them out. There's this story early on in the wilderness wanderings where God tells Moses, I want you to strike this rock and water will come out of this rock. And because the people needed water in the wilderness places and God was miraculously going to give them water. So Moses takes his staff, the staff that's been with him, the staff that represents miracle and testimony and witness, and he strikes the rock and water pours out. The problem is that later on by Numbers 20, Moses is supposed to have grown in his relationship with God, but Moses is growing frustrated with the people because they keep complaining, griping, murmuring. The things that we talked about in the first example, Moses is dealing with this same stuff. You've had kids, some of you have. If you've been around kids, or if you haven't, maybe the sermon illustration that you need more than hearing me preach again is that you need to sign up and work the nursery for a few weeks. Because kids are relentless when they want something. And they don't mind doing anything that it takes to manipulate your emotions or your patience in order to get it. That doesn't make them anything other than kids. In fact, that's what all immature people do. So Moses is underneath the strain and the weight of hundreds of thousands of people who are constantly grumbling, griping, and murmuring. They're asking him, why are we still here? When are we going to get some meat? I'm sick of this bread that keeps showing up every morning. I want to go back to Egypt. Man, you brought us out here to die. We had fish and vegetables in Egypt. Now we just eat manna all the time. What's wrong with you? Why did you? All this stuff. All day, every day for 38 years. And so God says, Moses, people need water again. I want you to speak to this rock. And Moses says, I know what I'm going to do with this rock. And he takes it, man, like Lou Gehrig. He sets up with his staff and he says, I got a word for you. And he lays into that rock with the wood of his staff and water pours out. Even though God told him to do it differently, water pours out. Now, let me just take a quick aside because I don't want to pass this up without saying this. I think there are a lot of implications could be pulled from this text. But one of the things that I think is beautiful is, for me, maybe what God is trying to do through Moses, he was setting him up to show a powerful example of how the old covenant was supposed to eventually give way to the new covenant. How the law with its judgment and its stringent punishments would give way to the word and its grace-filled equipping. See, eventually the word would prove to be stronger than the rod. Eventually, the cross and the empty tomb was going to prove that no matter what violence and aggression could actually produce, there was a word that could produce more on the other side. See, I think maybe God is trying to allow Moses to prophetically announce to the world thousands of years before Jesus was going to show up that the rod would be useful for a while, but there was a word that was coming that was going to be even more miraculous and useful. I think Moses was supposed to be able to preach the gospel in the wilderness, but instead Moses allowed his frustration to determine his methodology. Moses had a chance to prophetically declare something beautiful, but his anger and his temper got in the way. And I just wonder how often and how many times our impatience has kept us from opportunities to be prophetic. How often has our frustration kept us from saying the thing that literally could have changed people's lives? So look, here's where I want to go with this, just what the verse actually says, I believe, in Numbers 20. So when he struck the rock, he did it the wrong way, water still poured out. And here's where I want you to, I believe this is true, so I believe the text actually shows this. Because authority and position are not removed simply because bad decisions are made. If you're called to a place of authority and you do dumb, bad, or unfaithful things in that place of authority, your authority is not immediately taken away. Your influence continues to be powerful even though you're doing things the wrong way. So we've heard about this a lot. I think Jude is reaching a little bit into 2024 with this. So maybe Jude is speaking of some church leaders, some pastors, some deacons, some teachers, some worship leaders, elders who are gifted and who are influential in their ability and calling, but they're carnal and sinful in the way that they're walking it out. I'll tell you, with great fear, because I know that I'm not unlike anybody else. I'm one or two bad decisions away from having a completely different life right now. I'm not talking about like 10 years ago. I'm talking about tomorrow. Like I'm one or two bad, undisciplined decisions from standing up there Sunday weeping in that pulpit and having to walk away for good. And I keep seeing this over and over and over and over and over again. How many lives are left in the rubble of leaders who are still influential, but who have allowed their lives to become compromised. And so their authority is used in back rooms instead of in altars. And so they're manipulating people's emotions. And they're creating devastation in people's lives. And they're creating generations of distrust because they've been given a calling, they've been given authority, and when they speak or when they lead or when they cast vision, there's still power. Just like that rod still had power against the rock. He didn't do it like God told him, but the authority was not removed. Look at Ahab or Hezekiah or Uzziah. You can see over and over again how position does not necessarily equal holiness, but also when unholiness comes into position, position still has power and influence. What you've been given, you must be good stewards of. And that's not just me standing here. That's everyone with a calling. That's everyone with a responsibility. America does have a sin problem, I know that. But I think one of the craziest things we do in the church is when we seem to make our peace with bad leaders because they put on a good show. I guarantee you those angels didn't look any less glorious. And God said, I'm not impressed by the way that you look on the outside. It's the abuse of your position of authority that actually matters to me. I'm going to tell you something, church. The more we put up with people who talk a good talk, who are really talented, the more we give them a pass in terms of gross. I'm not talking about repentant people who are trying to serve. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who seem to be okay just moving forward in gross sin, unrepentant, because they're good preachers, because they sing really well, because they can entertain us. Give me an hour and a half of a boring minister who knows Jesus in his prayer closet before you give me 20 minutes of the most electric and dynamic evangelist who is sleeping with somebody he ought not be sleeping with the night before. I don't care about the show at this point. I need somebody who has an authentic power and they're using it wisely. But we have entered into a place in Western culture where we prefer those who are good at what they do instead of those who are good at being who God called them to be. And God says, in this verse, when people do not stay within their own position of authority, but leave their proper dwelling, he puts them in eternal chains under gloomy darkness. The ending of that story of Moses, real clear, Moses realizes, I cannot go into the place that God has for me. God called me to walk into the promised land, and I don't get to go because of what I have done with my authority. It was that one moment at that rock that God said, all right, I can't trust you in a place because you're too influential to allow you into that place of promise. I can't have that. So his bones settled in the wilderness. I can do verse 7 in 8 minutes. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities which indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, just as they serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. All right, so I told you 2 weeks ago or whenever I said this, this is the piñata for us too often, that homosexuality and sexual immorality are these things that, man, we can tee off on that real easily in our culture, in our nation, and then we lay into those people who are doing these things. I want to just talk through something real quick and tell you a story, and then I'll hush. What's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah and what's happening with sexual immorality and homosexuality is this. It is an example of people indulging in the opposite of morality and pursuing the opposite of order in terms of the order of creation. God doesn't care in terms of judgment anymore about people who are homosexuals as he does with people who are sleeping around. So let's stop acting like those are different things. Let's stop acting like one's eroding the country quicker. We wouldn't have Romans 1. I'm going to go to Romans 1. Romans 1 says it doesn't start there anyway. It ends there. The reason people have unnatural affection is because the rest of us created idols out of what we preferred instead of listening to the truth of God. So what's upstream? It's so easy to look at the problems of the moment and say, oh, this is the worst time in history. I'm like, well, what happened 40 years ago that led us to this part? What happened 150 years ago that led us to this place? Because this stuff doesn't happen overnight. Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't turn into what Sodom and Gomorrah is overnight. Remember what Jude's talking about? I just want to be careful with this. I don't want to be overbearing in either direction. So I want to tell you the truth, and that's all. Jude is saying that there is an internal threat to the church, right? Remember verses 3 and 4. The problem that we have. I wanted to talk to you about our common salvation, but I could not because there is a threat to the faith once given to the saints, right? That is the twisting or the perversion of grace. This is the issue. It's an internal issue. So what are we looking for? What is an internal threat in the church? Those who are indulging in the opposite of morality, those who are pursuing the opposite of the order of creation. So Romans 1. Let me read a couple things here. I'll make sure this is encouraging before I finish. You should read Romans 1, 18 through 32. That's the broader passage. I don't have time for that. Let's go to verses 24, 20, and 25. Romans 1. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts. Look carefully at that language. In the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. If you move on down into the later parts of that passage, you will see what happens at the end of that road is that men and women exchange even natural affections and then gather with their own gender in terms of immorality and acts of sexual explicit immorality. That comes at the end of that text. What happens at the beginning? Look in verse 19 in Romans 1. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. If you look in Romans 1:18, it says that there's not a lack of truth in the world, but there is a suppression of truth in the world. As soon as any of us begin to give up the truth that God has showed us in creation, through Christ, in the canon of Scripture, anytime we start to trade those things in any way, we are literally beginning to pave the pathway that leads to the kind of culture that we find ourselves in right now. Okay? I don't have to assemble with the saints. I can worship at home. The Bible doesn't say that that's the truth. The Bible actually says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together. That's a really clear thing. And I'm not talking about coming to church. I'm talking about eating with people. Because I think sometimes we use Sunday morning from 10 to 12, or 12:30 if I'm preaching. We use Sunday morning as this retreat, and then we kind of get back in our giant SUVs and inside of our homes, and we huddle up and say, all right, I'll get back there next Sunday morning, but I'll just put that on the shelf for now. Like, where is the assembling of ourselves as the apostles assembled themselves together? Now, I think that we can show up on Sunday and still miss out on aligning our lives with the truth of what God has told us is actually true. We stopped turning the other cheek and we started pulling guns on people. And then we griped about homosexuals. We exchanged the truth of God for a lie because the lust of our heart leads us to impurity. And then eventually we look around us and we see a world that we don't recognize. And we think, oh, this world's a terrible place. Well, it got there somehow. We stopped carrying the soldier's gear for the extra mile. We stopped giving not just our shirt, but our coat as well. We stopped doing the things that Jesus told us we were supposed to do. Or we griped about it and begrudgingly did it. I guess I've got to be generous. Now listen, you guys have been generous all week long, so I don't want to bang on this drum in terms of that alone, but I'm just telling you, the world we live in now is the result of something. It's not the origination of something. And so the answer is not to look at people in the street who are different than us, who are doing things that we know are destructive and sinful. Can I be real clear? Sinful. And point our fingers at them and say, if you don't quit it, we're going to hell. I'm going to tell you something. You better canoe back upstream and see where we lost sight of the truth of God. Let's go back upstream and look at where those waters started flowing, not just where they pooled up at the end. Because that's where the solution is going to be found. When we lose the order of creation, when we lose the word of God that keeps us steady, we wind up snowballing into devastating places. Sexual immorality and homosexuality in Sodom and Gomorrah and the United States of America, they are symptoms, they are not sources. Where have we ignored God's instructions? Where have we doubted what God said to be true? Can I just tell you, like, even saying all this makes me tired. Can I just be real clear? Like, this is so hard to say. Not because it's not true, but because I would much rather people be raised to new life than have to talk about how much death there is around us. And it is. I mean, I just feel like energy sapped out of my body and my spirit, and I know everything I'm saying is biblical. So I don't... In the car yesterday, we were driving to North Carolina to take the stuff, and I was talking actually with Cody and Cohen, with Amber's kids. And it was a broad array of conversation. Once they lost cell service and started asking questions, that trip became a whole different trip. But one of the things that I was told about D.L. Moody, I can't remember, still can't remember who said it, but they said if anybody's ever going to preach on hell, I want it to be D.L. Moody, because he never preaches about hell without weeping while he's saying it. And man, I think if we can walk into the public square with our chests pumped out, grandiose swagger about us, saying, you people are the reason this nation's going to hell, we have lost the heart of Christ. If we're not looking at the destruction of our culture with tears in our eyes, from our knees, in prayer and intercession, then maybe we should just shut up about it. Even from the cross, Jesus said, please, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Abraham finds out what's going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, and he bargains with God. If there's 50, will you not destroy the whole place? If there's 40, if there's 30, if there's 10. But there comes a point even where Abraham says, I can't even with good conscience ask you to do it any further than this. There does come a point where we realize that God has to clean things up. But I'm telling you, that comes after we've interceded for the people who are in destruction. If we're not fighting on our knees for people who are going to hell, then shut our mouths. Because that posture, the posture of prayer, and the posture of humility, and the posture that would rather see the people that we would want to condemn raised to new life by the power of the Spirit, that's the posture that allows the gospel to go into the world in beautiful and profound ways. It doesn't mean we don't tell the truth, and it doesn't mean we don't tell the plain truth. But it means that the posture of our heart while we're telling it cannot be with arrogance or pride. It has to be with humility, through tears, and in intercession. All right, let me finish this up. I've gone over, I'm sorry. But I'm kind of sorry, not all that sorry. So I know it's a hard word, I know, like I said. I went over this again this morning. I read back through my notes. I added some things, took away some things, and I just put it to the side before lunch because I knew I didn't want to have to meditate on this all day long. And then even about an hour before this, just like I'm all pinned up, bound up, just I don't want to say this, but I got to say it. This is a hard word, but I knew that it would be when I started the series. I do share the great hope that Jude has, hopefully, that hard words make tender hearts. But I also think that we have to see this the other way as well. So just briefly, I'll read this. When we refuse to grumble and instead hold to the faith that God's promises are our inheritance, and when we reject the allure of abusing our gifts and calling and embrace obedience to God's kingdom work in the world, and when we put away our idols so that the living water of the gospel can flow through our altars and into our cities, when we do the three things opposite of the warnings of Jude, when we embrace the faith and untwist God's grace, we can again talk about and celebrate and know the fullness of the joy of our salvation. I told you a couple weeks ago, the beauty of this text is that Jude said, I wanted to talk about our common salvation. I don't think Jude ever lost the desire to talk about the common salvation. He just had to bring correction before they could. I want to talk about the joy of our common salvation. I want to talk about what God did in your life and what he did in my life. I want to talk about how he forgave me and set me free and made me new and raised my life to beautiful new places. I want to hear your stories and testimonies. I want to hear our children come into those places where they're sharing those stories as well. But there has to be a correction if we're ever going to truly be able to talk about those things. There is joy, but there has to be correction as well. I almost got you to stand. I'm so used to Sunday morning. So let me just tell you the story. I'll be done. Promise this is the last thing in my notes. That stuff in green. That's it. I'm almost done. So back in 1992, Michael Plant he decided he was going to sail a huge part of the world, maybe around the world. I can't remember anyway. This was his third. It was around the world complete. He was going to sail. This was his third trip. He'd already done this twice. And so he wanted to do it differently. And so he designed and built a racing vessel that he called the Coyote. He built it for $650,000. It was a lightweight, fiberglass coated, foam core hull sailboat that was extremely fast. It was equipped with the latest technology. In October 16th, 1992, he launched from New York, and he headed out across the Atlantic Ocean toward France. A 24,000-mile, 4-month journey. But it was not long into the trip before Plant started to experience trouble. No one heard anything from him for several days. And then on October 21st, remember he took off on the 16th, on the 21st of October, a passing Russian freighter picked up his transmission. He said, "I have no power, but I'm working on the problem." Pentecostals, can I just tell you that ain't the answer? If you have no power, get in the presence of Jesus. Don't go working on stuff. Call for help. He said, "I'm working on the problem." And then he ended the transmission with this request. He said, "Please tell my fiance not to worry." That was the last direct communication that anyone ever had with Michael Plant. After 32 days, the Coyote was finally spotted on a Sunday morning by a Greek tanker. It was drifting upside down, and there was no sign of Plant. The mast was still fully open, in full sail, but it was upside down. It had plunged 85 feet into the frigid waters of the North Atlantic. The hull was still intact on the boat, but the keel was vertical, and that exposed the fatal problems. That means that the sailboat was upside down completely. Here was the fatal problem. He had put an 8,400-pound lead keel bulb. So if you look at a picture, some of you don't maybe know what that is. If you look at a picture of a sailboat, underneath a sailboat, there is a thin piece of steel, and then there's this bulb. Almost looks like a missile or a torpedo down below that thing. That is the bulb. The bulb actually allows the sailboat to remain upright because the wind would just blow the sailboat over if it didn't have foundation that was below the water. The 8,400-pound lead keel bulb that weighted the boat had sheared off. And so to this day, no one knew if it was a rogue whale or sea garbage or just a faulty build that damaged the boat. But, and this is the part that I'd read that was so powerful to me, without the weight of the ballast, the small boat was useless against the cross currents and the high winds of the open seas. The ballast's weight in the lowest part of the vessel would give it stability and balance in the rough seas, and without it, the vessel would become top-heavy and be easily overpowered by the angry ocean. Jude does not hate the church. Jude wants to make sure that the weight that keeps us afloat and upright in the roughest seas of life does not break off and cause us to end up capsizing. When we grumble instead of walk in gratitude when we're in the wilderness, when we use the influence, calling, and gifts of God on our life for evil instead of good, and when we don't allow the truth of God's created order to govern every aspect of our life, what we wind up with is a loss of the thing that keeps us upright. Part of that, a huge part of that, is this. The truth of God as given to us in His Word. It's also here. It's the truth of God as distributed in the body of Christ. Sometimes it's there and it's here. It's in pulpits and it's from platforms as we sing together and as people that God has ordained open up the Scriptures and deliver the Word of God to them. It's all of those things. But when we lose those things, Jude comes along to tell us there's been a perverting, a twisting of the faith. And Jude says, I love the church too much to say nice things before I bring the weight that focuses us and balances us back into our lives.